Ich habe den Führermythos geschaffen. Wissen Sie, wie der Propagandaminister der Engländer oder Stalins heißt? Aber Joseph Goebbels, den kennt jeder.
You can use social media, you can use increasingly powerful propaganda means, reaching out to masses, and you can turn those parts of society to your constituency. And your rivals can do the same. So these are the conditions we face, and no escape from them.
Seid ihr entschlossen?
The idea that statements don't need to be true if they are in the service of a bigger truth, if they are capable of moving the masses in the right direction in the service of the bigger truth, this kind of using lots of language full of images, or even literally using images, creating this alternative reality, even kind of the flooding of the public sphere with white noise.
Wir stimmen ein Höllenkonzert an. Immer weiter hetzen und putschen.
If this film can help us to understand the patterns of disinformation, maybe then we can really try to get people to realize that how much of catch-up we have to play.
Wir sind so wahrheitsgetreu, wie es uns nützlich ist.
Welcome back to part 2 of our panel discussions on the world wars of disinformation and demagoguery. So this second panel is called Propaganda, Misinformation and Manipulation and the Collapse of Democracy. So lots of very big words and big concepts, but some very powerful stories behind them, because we're going to be comparing then and now. Now, next to me is Zoltán Ádám. He is Senior Research Fellow at the Department of Government and Public Policy at the HUNREN Centre for Social Sciences in Budapest. Dr. Ádám is an expert on 21st century regime change, democratic backsliding, and authoritarian populism in Hungary and around the world, around Europe particularly. In October 2023, he was dismissed as head of the Department of Economic Policy and Labour Economics at Corvinus University in Budapest. Now, many say that this dismissal confirms growing fears about the state of academic freedom in Hungary and of democracy, the state of democracy. Thomas Weber you've met already, but I'm going to introduce him again for the sake of the panel, just in case somebody's switched off. How dare they? We want them to watch everything. Thomas Weber, to my far right there, is far right, not obviously in any other form except for on the far right of the, he's on the centre right. But Thomas Weber is the historical consultant on Führer und Verführer, which we're calling in English Goebbels and the Führer. He's Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of Aberdeen and a visiting fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. His most recently published his book is Als die Demokratie starb, die Machtergreifung der Nationalsozialisten, Geschichte und Gegenwart, and the German edition of his new book, The First Battle of Britain, Nazi Disinformation and Foreign Interference in Britain, will be published later this year in German. And just very briefly, just to remind ourselves what is happening, 2024 is the year of elections. We have a war in Europe, instability in the Middle East, threats from Russia, China and North Korea. Propaganda, misinformation and fake news have the potential to polarize public opinion, to promote violent extremism and hate speech, and ultimately to undermine democracies. Zoltán, to you first. What is happening? Can you outline what is happening today before we go back in history and look at the causes and the repercussions and the consequences? What's happening today?
What's happening today in the world?
Yeah. Well, you can start in Hungary. You can start with your story, perhaps, because that is a potentially a very important story to explain what's happening in Hungary and then the rest of Europe.
Okay. Well, of course, I'm not here to comment on my own story, how important it is, but it may signal some slippage towards an increasingly authoritarian way of government in my country, I suppose. So it's actually by now it's a relatively long story. I have to say that it started back in 2010. In some sense, it had started even earlier. The weakening of democracy, the democratic government in my country and in other countries of Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, did start before 2010, but definitely the economic crisis of 2008-9 was an important turning point. So populism scholars consider the global financial and economic crisis of 2008-9, the collapse of Lehman Brothers and everything which came afterwards, as a turning point in the history of Western democracy. So if you think about the rise of Le Pen, the rise of Trump in America, the Brexit movement in Britain, so all this global rise of increasingly authoritarian populism started sometimes back then. And Hungary is a very interesting case in that context, I believe, because very early on, back in 2010, a basically relatively moderate right-wing party led by Viktor Orbán, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, became transformed into an increasingly anti-democratic authoritarian political force in a very, very powerful way. And why exactly it happened in Hungary, it's a big question. I believe some institutional factors played an important role. So Hungary was a kind of a majoritarian political system in which a simple political majority could be transformed relatively easily to a supermajority. And once you've got a supermajority, in a way similar to what Hitler did have back in the 1930s with his enabling law, it became a sort of a totalitarian power force, what we experienced in Hungary. And propaganda did play a very important role there.
Thomas, do you think that certain countries have the propensity, such as Hungary, Germany, as it was, to become or to use propaganda to become more totalitarian, to become sort of better at misinformation, manipulation, and so on? What is it about specific countries and cultures?
It's a good question. In a way, I think we should probably even zoom out more, because I think both in the present and the past, we've often fallen into the trap that we just look at one case and then we somehow think this is all about Hitler or all about Germany, or now this is all about Hungary or whatever country you pick. But the truth of the matter is that in interwar Europe, about half of Europe, liberal democracy survived. In the other half, liberal democracy fell. Actually, it was a majority in which liberal democracy fell. But all of Europe were generally dealing with the same kind of crises. Again, today, 2008 and after, and all these other crises that we have gone through and that people perceive as existential, all or nothing, do or die crises, they don't just happen in countries like Hungary, but they happen everywhere. But the question then becomes, why is it that some countries are then resilient and others are not? And in many ways, I think we often, to our detriment, only look at the cases of breakdown. It's, I think it's often actually quite instructive to look at cases where democracy survives in a moment like that. So you could ask today, why is it that in certain countries that have structural similarities with Hungary, democracy survived? Or in that book that we brought out, Als die Demokratie starb, one of the chapters which I think is most interesting is a chapter on democratic survival in the Netherlands in 1933, where the question is, why is it there is a country where things were also not so clear but indeterminate? Why did democracy survive there when in Germany it collapsed?
I mean, the interesting thing is here we are sitting all these decades later and we still don't know all the answers of why this happened specifically, or why Hitler became Hitler. We make all these films, we write all these books, but I wonder, do you feel that you've actually got to the answer of that problem?
I think I would probably be a very rich man if I had, if I had the answer. But I think in a way we might actually, we might come closer. I certainly hope that over the years I have come closer to understanding Hitler, and the breakdown of democracy. But I think we might also come closer if we ask better questions. Also, if we actually want to apply history to the present, don't ask constantly, is politician X Hitler? It's kind of a stupid question. I mean, Hitler will not come back.
It's showing me I've got to ask better questions.
No, you didn't. You didn't ask the question.
But it is fair enough. We've all got an individual responsibility, obviously, and we've all got to be less ignorant. But so keep going. Sorry.
So people ask, is Trump, is Orban, is Erdogan? You can go on and on. The new Hitler, and they say no, they're not. Hitler will never come back in that form. Or people look, when they look at whether there's a repeat of 1933, they look for Reichstagsfire moments. And if they are not there, they somehow think, well, then it somehow must be different. But the actual forms of democratic breakdown, they will take different forms. I think it's far more useful to look at the drivers of...
Zoltán, what are the elements, the mechanisms then, the drivers of disinformation and breakdown of democracy? I mean, you've mentioned together crises, economic crises particularly, weakness of democracy. What other elements do they have in common?
Yeah, I think it's quite salient. You've got a kind of a recurring pattern of mobilizing losers of social change. So because social change sort of accelerated over the decades. In history, I think it's fair to say, and then, but also the political skills to mobilize those who are perceiving changes as threatening their existential status in society. They are also being in progress. So you can use social media, you can use increasingly powerful propaganda means, reaching out to masses, and you can turn those parts of society to your constituency. And once you've got a sizable part of society behind you, and you've got the power, you've got the government power, you can manufacture a majority in your society. And once you've got the majority in a democratic system, it enables you to consolidate your increasingly monopolistic power. I think this is what we witnessed in Hungary, of course, not in a fascistic way. I want to make a distinction. So this is not fascism what we experience in Hungary.
Hungary is still a democracy.
Hungary is still a democracy, but it's very interesting to observe how propaganda can sort of manipulate perceptions, public perceptions over the years, over the decades. But once you've got some kind of new developments, new problems a political regime may face, then because it is a democracy, because there is still democratic voting in the sense of rival political parties contesting power, then new parties, new political entrepreneurs can emerge. We just do have one emerging recently.
You have a new party.
We've got a new party, a new opposition
But they formed
force.
from within Fidesz, from within Orban's party.
This is a kind of a dissident from Orban's party, and very surprisingly and very dramatically, he staged sort of a coup. No, that's not the right word. He staged kind of a new political uprising, both in the opposition camp to some extent, maybe also in Orban's camp, and now he's the hopeful opposition candidate. It did happen. I think it couldn't happen in Hitler's Germany that an internal opposition stages a coup against Hitler.
So is it simplistic then to compare 1933 with 2024? I mean, is it?
No, I don't think so. I mean,
we're not at that stage though, or are we?
Well, I think in terms of the drivers of what's happening, we are, and in many ways it's also maybe rather a better question rather than to ask, are we experiencing exactly breakdown in the same way that we experienced 1933? We may want to look at even a longer time period. So let's look at the last 200 years, and why is it that at certain times there is breakdown? Also, why, if we talk about disinformation and demagoguery, why are there, I'd say, depending on how we define it, between 2 and 5, world wars of disinformation and demagoguery since propaganda as a modern term has emerged in the revolutionary of 1830. So why is it that in the 1920s, 1940s, and today we are experiencing a world war of disinformation and demagoguery, and there we might see the same conditions that are coming together. I mean, there I would say it's particularly the confluence of crisis perception, of an existential crisis, often actually the delayed impact of that. When that comes together with technological revolution, I think then you get the kind of perfect storm where world wars of disinformation and demagoguery can have a chance, even if then the forms of democratic breakdown take different forms. But the other point I would make there is, again, let's not just look at what happened in January of 1933. So for one, even if we stick with the example of Germany, democracy did not suddenly die on January 30th of 1933, but it was also a period from the mid-1920s, probably to 1934, of democratic backsliding and then consolidation. So maybe even with Nazi Germany, we should kiss goodbye to this idea that this happened all overnight. But maybe more importantly, let's also look at other countries in interwar Europe. We might actually there also see, in some countries it was a backsliding, like today. In other countries there was a backsliding, but it's still democratic survival. In a way, the interesting question about today also is, why is it that in some cases things really seem to get worse and worse, while in others the half-time of radicalization is maybe not as long as one thought. So maybe Poland is a case where we see the half-time maybe wasn't that long. Maybe Greece, maybe Britain.
Maybe Britain.
In Britain, I would have said a few weeks ago or a few months ago, we said the half-time was short, and now so short.
Mm. We have an election very soon in Britain, and it could be a big change for us after 14 years as well. But yes, but those slogans also you mentioned before, of course, Brexit and Trump, and the use of slogans that became very important. Brexit was basically under the heading "Take Back Control," and with Trump, it's "Make America Great Again." And I want to talk about the specific language and propaganda. I mean, I know that democratic backsliding is is an interesting specialism, but it is a very, very important one. Can you talk a little bit about that, about the words, the mechanisms of propaganda? And there are comparisons, of course, with the 1930s and today.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's pretty language specific. So I could elaborate on probably mainly on the Hungarian language of propaganda, but there's also very interesting connections between propagandas in the plural globally in a sense. So for instance, in the Hungarian case, what you can observe is that pretty heavy impact of Russian propaganda being exerted on Hungarian propaganda. Some slogans are being actually adopted from the Russian propaganda machine being used in Hungary. I guess generally you can claim that it's pretty nationalistic, pretty kind of self-serving, interest-driven politics. So the claim is that we take back our own land from external enemies, threats, from the people, and we are the one who represent the people. So this is again a kind of
we have the national interests at heart.
We have a national interest at heart, and only we can express that. So that's also very important in populisms in the plural, that we are the genuine representative of the people, and in that sense, it's a totalitarian vision of power. So you can also there's a Argentinian philosopher called Finkelstein. Federico Finkelstein, who claims that modern populism is kind of a reincarnation of fascism, in the sense that it's a totalitarian vision of power in a democratic setting.
So democracy itself has changed?
Democracy itself has changed, and it hasn't changed in the sense that this has been around since at least the aftermath of the Second World War. So you can think about Juan Perón in Argentina, who is in many ways the archetype modern populist, who staged a coup, but afterwards who was democratically elected by the majority of Argentinians with a kind of a totalitarian vision, being a populist, being democratically elected.
Thomas, we talk more about the language because I do think it's crucial, and we see this in the film, of course, Goebbels and the Führer, that it's the repetition, it's the reduction to the simplest, the basic common denominator. It's using many words over and over again, and their lies. They don't have to be true to be effective. Can you talk us through that language from that period and whether you recognise that happening today?
Yes, I do. And I think it works on two levels. The first level is, as you've indicated, it's the endless repetition of particular slogans, of simplified slogans that are being presented in a very kind of emotionally, in a very emotional, charged language. The idea that statements don't need to be true if they are in the service of a bigger truth, if they are capable of moving the masses in the right direction in the service of the bigger truth. This kind of using lots of language full of images, or even literally using images, creating this alternative reality, even kind of the flooding of the public sphere with white noise. I think with all of that, we have a great similarity. The next question then is, does it also work in terms of what, more specifically, what is being said? Because of course, what we've just described.
Does it matter even what is said? Because it doesn't even have to be intellectual, erudite or clever when it's propaganda.
Well, yes and no. I mean, it matters if it's directed at a particular kind of language. I mean, you can endlessly simplify language and repeat things and tell little lies to make people listen to Taylor Swift, and nothing wrong with that. Or you can use it to direct it against immigrants, and that and that might actually result in violence against immigrants that might end up in civil war. So I think in that sense, the content of what is being said really does matter. And here, in a way, it's also the point I was trying to make earlier, is I'm concerned that we're not even seeing how similar the language often is, because we have a tendency now to reduce Hitler to just someone who is just constantly saying the most outrageous of things, and then people come to the conclusion, well, look what the populist right is saying today. It's bad, but it's not bad, it's different. And let me just give you one example. So for instance, a few months ago in Germany, there was, of course, big brouhaha over demands of remigration, of getting immigrants out of Germany again. And then the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, they try to distance themselves from it by saying, well, of course we don't support this. Of course we don't want to get German citizens out of the country, what is being discussed here. What we're demanding here is something very different. And then it's all about the talk about what happened since 2015, and then maybe people should at some point return and so on. But then if you look at what they don't realize is that in trying to distance themselves from this cartoon version of remigration, they have brought themselves closer to the historical Nazi version of it, because that is precisely what was in Article 8 or Point 8 of the Nazi Party manifesto, was a demand that people who had, in that case, not since 2015, but since 1914, come to Germany, that they had to leave the country again. Currently, we're seeing in terms of language, in recent days, there's been a big public discussion in the Netherlands over the likely future Minister of Migration and Asylum, who used the word Umvolkung, or the Dutch version of Umvolkung, and there's a tendency now to say, well, look, it's really bad though what she's saying here, but she's not using it in the Nazi sense, in the 1941 Nazi sense of creating a new Lebensraum in the East, but she is using it in a very different kind of new way of repopulation. Then I looked at speeches that Hitler gave in the early 1920s, and it turns out that is precisely what Hitler has been saying. So I think even in the political content, if we actually get beyond the cartoon version of Hitler and Goebbels, it's scary to see how not just through repetition and endless lies and flooding of the public spheres, but even in terms of the political slogans and political demands, we're seeing a return of the past.
What's very interesting is in the film Goebbels and the Führer, you see the different platforms that are used and abused, how they used radio, for instance, how they had these banners and slogans all over these huge mass rallies. It was very cleverly orchestrated, and you could see the process that continued over many years. They were learning each year how to get better at it, and how to use it to even greater effect, and how to pile the lies upon lies to make it work, even to the point in 1943 when Germany was facing defeat in Stalingrad, that Goebbels was able to rally the German people to this idea of total war. And in order to look again here today at the different platforms that we use, we have so many more available. I mean, we have extraordinary access to technology now. And I'd like to talk about the platforms we use today, not necessarily to compare them, but to see the power of the platforms. Social media is obviously one. Specialist websites, encrypted messaging systems and so on. Can you talk a little bit about that, about how today the message is spread?
Yeah, well, that's also a super important and interesting question. How social media being used by the populists and by the mainstream Democrats, if you like, and obviously they both use it. And if I just go back to our most recent Hungarian case, where a new political entrepreneur gained a significant political support, about 1/3 of the vote. The most recent European elections in Hungary, he did use social media.
This is Péter Magyar.
This is Péter Magyar, exactly, who basically built a powerful political movement from scratch in a period of 2 or 3 months, essentially using no money at all on Facebook and Instagram, basically. And these social media platforms did enable him to build a new political movement. And in that sense, I think it's very hopeful to have these social media platforms, because they keep the political space sort of open towards new challengers, new entrepreneurs. At the same time, having said that, it's super dangerous, of course, because the social media platforms are being used by the populist entrepreneurs as well, and they can reach very effectively their own constituency, and they can sort of compartmentalize the political space and very effectively pick the ones who sort of belong to them and kind of insulate them from any other impact, because if you are on Facebook or Twitter, wherever, you are in a bubble, as we know, and then the communication may break down. So it's a kind of double-edged sword. But I think as long as you can come and use them, so the internet is not closed down like in China, you can be hopeful.
Are you hopeful? I mean, I always see social media as my enemy and my friend. I love it for many reasons, but I also fear it. And when you read the statistics, they're pretty scary about how people are manipulated, how we are manipulated.
I'm less hopeful, but it might still help that I'm still by sentiment and optimist. So I still also, like Zoltán, see the possibility. I think we should maybe even talk more about how social media could also be used to counter disinformation, how to build resilience.
But before you get to that moment, you have to see how negative it is.
No, I'm getting there, don't worry. I mean, I'm pessimist enough, I'm doomsday enough that I will now happily lay that out. I mean, in many ways, I think even though I said earlier that we're again seeing this kind of confluence of crisis perception and technological revolution, we're seeing such a technological revolution that in a way we're really just seeing the same thing that we've seen in the past on steroids and on ways that are so difficult to control. Of course, we also have to think, I mean, you already talked about China as if China was somehow we don't have to worry about it. It's a huge part of the world. Look at Russia. In Russia, initially, social media, the Russian equivalents of Facebook, Twitter, and so on, initially they were seen by Putin as undermining his rule. But again, it goes back to what you said. They've been constantly learning. They've gone to try to figure out how they can use it. And they appropriated them. And now, at a time in which I think it's something like 40% of the Russian population now can get their information through that. They get disinformation, Kremlin disinformation that is then endlessly amplified and spread through that. The impact of memes is terrible.
And the super spreaders, those people who know how to pinpoint thousands of people with one tweet or with one.
Exactly, and I think that's also why I'm worried, because on one level I'm positive in thinking about, well, look, maybe we really just have got to invest far more time and money into trying to see how, for instance, we can use AI to counter disinformation, to counter radicalization, but at the same time you just have so many really committed malicious actors out there who are extremely good at this game, that I'm worried that we'll always be lacking behind, and I think we will have got to do a lot of catch up before it's too late. And if this film can help us to understand the patterns of disinformation and demagoguery, how this actually functions, maybe then we can really try to get people to realize that how much of catch-up we have to play.
And I hope that it also promotes much more discussion in the way that we're having discussion too, because films like this are there also to talk about and to tell people about. And before we finish this panel, just very quickly, I mean, propaganda works only if there are people who are able to promote and push propaganda, demagogues. Are we seeing a different kind of demagogue today? Are there different people running the propaganda?
Different to the ones in the 1930s, you mean?
Yes. Are they behind the social media accounts? We might not see them. Are they the ones running the cyber attacks, the sabotage, the AI deep fakes? Who are the propagandists today?
I think in some sense everybody is forced to be, obviously everybody is forced to be out there, not to be a propagandist in the sense of disseminating lies. I don't think you are forced to disseminate lies, but you are definitely participating in any sort of social conversation through social media, through platforms, through the web. So I can tell you, I was a local candidate at the most recent Hungarian local elections, and I was using heavily social media platforms and the internet, of course. It comes with a responsibility, and it comes with huge opportunities. You can reach relatively easily a great part of your potential constituency, and your rivals can do the same. So these are the conditions we face, and no escape from them.
I would say things are fairly similar in the way that we, in the same way that Goebbels wasn't just a one-person enterprise, but he ran an extraordinarily big propaganda machine.
He had a ministry behind him.
Exactly, he had a ministry behind it, which I think, if I remember correctly, I think he had the second highest budget of any ministry. So this was literally an army of propagandists, and all these little propagandists, they were doing the same thing that people are doing today who are sitting by the computer, the kind of all the trolls of the Kremlin. At the same time, we do have someone sitting in the Kremlin. So if we, for instance, I'm just thinking, for instance, about the new work on how Putin weaponizes both history as well as religion by Niels Drost and Beatrice de Graaf in the Netherlands, what they're ultimately doing, I mean, Putin and people like them are ultimately doing there is really not that different in terms of how propaganda is being done from the Goebbels of the time, even if the political message is a different one. So again, we have the great propaganda masters today, and we have all the foot soldiers.
Thank you both so much. There's so much, again, to think about, and which is the point of these discussions. So I'd like to thank Zoltán Ádám very much, and Thomas Weber, once again, thank you so much. Thank you.